Hello everybody, it's Silver. This is the Thaumaturge. So this is an investigation RPG that takes place in a very historically relevant place and period of time. This actually takes place in 1905 Warsaw in Poland, a time when Poland didn't technically exist as a single entity on a map, but rather was carved up between several different smaller entities that were all kind of vying for the area. And of course you also had a lot of pressure from the Tsarist forces of Russia at the time, because some things don't change much. And you are a thaumaturge, and this game is taking the more historically accurate definition of that term as a miracle worker. In fact, you're almost like a wizard psychologist. The idea is you're looking for salutors. Salutors are, basically it means visitor, and they are entities from mythology and things, especially like Slavic mythology, so you may find stuff like the Bukovac or the Slavic god of the dead, Veles, and of course you've also got like some other sources like Arabian mythology with things like a jinn. And the idea is you're looking for people with flaws with a capital F. And a flaw in this case is basically a personality quirk that has become such a huge flaw that it's affecting their entire life and the people around them rather than just themselves. It's basically running their personality. Salutors are attracted to people with flaws, and it's your job to investigate an area to find a salutor, and then find out who's got the flaw, what the flaw is, and eventually capture the salutor for yourself. In doing so, you remove the flaw from the individual and actually take it into yourself. So it's basically mental trauma Pokemon. So first off, the presentation of the game is something to talk about because it's quite pretty. I think it punches above its weight a little bit in terms of its price point and the fact that it's not quite like a full AAA experience, because I think it looks quite good. Individual textures and things can be a little muddy here and there, but I think overall the aesthetic that the game actually goes for, being a very historically relevant, kind of dismal aesthetic, because this is, this is early 1900s Poland, so there's a lot of mud, a lot of stone, a lot of more neutral colors like that, but it looks really good, and a lot of the areas look quite old and well worn, and they do a good job of presenting the more bustling areas of the city as being well lived in. So it goes for a top-down perspective, which is a little bit unusual, although you can zoom in a bit if you need to. And I think overall the game looks really good from this vantage point. I think it's a good choice, it does a good job. And you've also occasionally, you can find these little kiosks in the street that give you like a sort of 3D, not quite a panorama, but like a little projection of an area that is a little bit more photorealistic. They look really good. And in particular, the loading screens look really, really good. They also go for this sort of slightly moving 3D panorama style, and they're like highly photorealistic looking, and they just look excellent. So the overall atmosphere of the game, due to its presentation, is dismal, dark, kind of depressing in a lot of ways, which goes with the territory, considering when and where we are. But you'll also mix these sort of neutral, cold areas with warmer, more opulent areas, like, for instance, the house of the main character, who is from a very rich family, very rich. So you've got a lot of rich, warm wood tones and stuff like that in the house, and a lot of metal and brightly accented areas that look opulent. And then you've got the more supernatural elements of the game creeping in, and they do a good job with this because they mostly color code this concept. Basically, everything involving salutors is red. Everything about the supernatural thaumaturgical aspects of the game uses this kind of palish red color. And I think that's a really good touch because it allows you to see where the supernatural is bleeding into this world without it being extremely obvious, like, things don't like grow flesh and look all crazy Silent Hill or anything. It's just like a red tinge to stuff that makes them look just a little bit off. And in fact, there are even moments where you are running through a fog to get some story elements from your main salutor Upar. And you have to run through this kind of reddish fog, and all of the streetlights and gas lamps and stuff around the city turn this pinkish red color. So it creates a nice atmosphere, and it's a good way to show when supernatural stuff is happening. You just involve this color and you know. Mechanically, this is a game where you have to read a lot. Now that is something that I don't mind, I like to read, but it's something that I feel I need to mention because, people may see screenshots of this game and see combat and stuff and think that it's going to be like highly actiony, and there is a pretty large amount of combat, but there is a much larger amount of investigation. This is a game where you're expected to read. The main gameplay loop works like this. You will be tasked with finding a salutor and figuring out the flaw of a person in a certain area. And when you reach that area, you can, at any point you want, just click the right mouse button and activate your perception, which is like, your supernatural perceptions as a thaumaturge. And this does a couple of things. When you use it, if you have a specific goal in mind where you're supposed to go, it will shoot out this little red tendril that tells you where to go. But more than that, it also causes you to notice things in the environment that you otherwise wouldn't. There'll be plenty of stuff for you to read and stuff that you can pick up in the environment just by going up to it, but there'll also be a bunch of hidden stuff that you don't immediately notice, and this is what the perception is for. When you use this, you'll see a bunch of like red sparks in the air, and if you can go where those sparks converge, then they'll reveal a new detail that you otherwise wouldn't have noticed. You can then click on this and you'll get one of these beautifully written little pieces of text about it. And these are really cool because they often try to explain emotion and stuff in more physical terms. So it'll describe emotions with colors and sensations and textures and smells and stuff like that, and memory. And I really like that concept because that's something that I struggle with in my own writing, is trying to properly describe these more intangible feelings and stuff with more tangible wording to help people's mind's eyes grasp what I'm talking about. And I really have a lot of respect for writing that manages to do that as well as this game does. So you'll get this lovely bit of writing to read that describes what you've found, and usually these are called traces, and they're basically emotions and memories and things from people around you, and they help you to get better context for what's been happening in that area. It could be a physical item like a cigarette butt that's soaked with envy and hatred or something, or it could be something a lot less tangible that you find someone's sort of emotional imprints on, and it helps you discover what they've been thinking recently. And eventually, as you go around an area examining all these sparks to find new traces, you'll reach a conclusion. All these traces will show in a big web and combine together to form a conclusion. And a conclusion, capital C, is just a sort of, this is what's been happening in regards to this person's mental state right now. And conclusions are noted down in your journal, and you can actually talk to people about them. When you go and talk to NPCs, you'll see a whole bunch of dialogue options that say that you need to find something more, and these are conclusions. And once you actually have that conclusion, then that dialogue option will be revealed, and you can actually ask them about it. So eventually you'll get several conclusions, and you'll be able to talk to various NPCs about what you found and figure out who is actually the one that this Salutor you're chasing is connected to, who are they latched onto, who has the flaw. And then eventually with enough conclusions you'll be able to understand what that flaw actually is, which is important because in order to cause the Salutor to manifest, you have to basically push them over the edge. You have to know what their flaw is and extract it from them, really push them by talking about it until they sort of break down. At this point, the Salutor will manifest for you. They don't actually manifest physically. And then you'll be able to fight it effectively. You don't actually fight it directly. It becomes like a giant background for a battle. It looks really cool. And then a bunch of sort of ghostly red enemies that represent the Salutor's resistance to you will manifest, and you have to fight those. And each time you defeat one of them, it will deplete the Salutor's health gauge until you eventually defeat all of them. And then you will capture this Salutor. However, that's not the end, because once you capture it, you are in pretty bad straits. You can't actually use it, and you will look your model will change. You'll look all sweaty, and you'll have like red, heavy eyes and stuff. It clearly takes a significant toll on you to do this. The flaw will be absent from the person that had it. They'll be sort of cured of their flaw, and then you will receive it. And then your perception will be sort of damaged. You won't be able to use it very well, and you won't be able to use your powers very well. And you'll have to go see our friend, a certain historical figure named Rasputin. And once you get to him, he can hypnotize you, which will show you sort of dominating, I guess you could say, this Salutor and actually fully capturing it and integrating it into yourself. And at that point, you'll look normal again. You'll be back to your old self. Your powers will activate, and you'll have command of this Salutor. And that's it. That's basically the gameplay loop. It's a loop of investigation, confrontation, combat, and then chilling out with Rasputin for a while. Speaking of combat, you will have to do it quite often in this game, not only with the Salutor forces, but also with various other enemies you'll find around the place. You'll find lots of thugs and ruffians of various types to face off against. And combat is turn-based, and it uses this sort of gauge-based time system, where at the top of the screen you'll see various length gauges that represent chunks of time. And every action you can take has a length of a certain amount, and you can sort of act depending on the length of those gauges, where shorter gauges mean a quicker attack, but often a longer gauge is a more powerful attack. And you can sort of insert your own stuff before an enemy gets to act, maybe be able to interrupt them or something, or even just knock them out outright. And it's you and all of your salutors that get to act. You can swap them out whenever you want, as long as one of them isn't currently preparing an attack. You can only use one at a time. But yeah, you can swap them out freely, and it doesn't take a turn or anything. And each one has a different selection of attacks and different strengths. You'll also find a lot of enemies have something called a trait, which is some sort of significant buff, like making them immune to status effects or decreasing all damage they take by 80% or something really significant like that. And these can only be disabled if you attack them with a certain salutor. So you are encouraged to swap around pretty often to make sure to hit all the weaknesses of all of your enemies. This means the combat system is actually a little bit like a Shin Megami Tensei game, where you have these summons that you're controlling, and the point is to manage a lot of status effects, a lot of time-based stuff, and stack up different weakness attacks to make enemies vulnerable. Status effects in this game are all really powerful and things that you need to manage carefully, and a lot of them can be inflicted by you as well as by enemies. You'll also see those little yellow diamond-shaped things above the health gauge. That's called focus, and this is not a resource that you spend, but rather it's like a secondary health gauge, kind of. You have various attacks that can damage focus, and enemies also tend to have attacks that damage both health and focus at the same time. When focus is completely depleted, you go into a breakdown state, which means your next action that you've queued up is cancelled, and you're sort of stunned for a turn. And during the time where you're stunned like this, you are vulnerable to strong attacks, which are special attacks that are normally grayed out. Both you and all of your salutors have a strong attack that's grayed out most of the time until you're facing an enemy that's been put into this breakdown state, and then you can use it. And these are extremely powerful. Yours just does a massive amount of damage to one target, and all your salutor's strong attacks are usually something that does a ton of damage and has some sort of effect on everyone else in some way too. So managing your focus is really important, and also managing your own focus is important, because enemies can deplete yours and do strong attacks against you as well. Healing in this game is interesting because everything that heals you is actually an attack. You don't have like potions or consumables or bandages or anything like that. So all of your healing has to be done by your salutor's various attacks. Some of them can heal you, but all of the things that heal you also give you a debuff that makes further healing less and less effective as it stacks up. So you'll need to either wait until it goes off in order to heal again some more if you can wait, or use something that transfers your status effects to an enemy or something like that. It's all about managing these effects to be as efficient as possible, and I think it works really well. I think it's a fun combat system. It's decently tactical, and it's fairly challenging in the later game as well. In terms of character development, you do have some options. As you do stuff, almost anything, fights, reading stuff on the ground, finding new traces with your thaumaturgical powers, all this stuff will give you experience. And once your experience gauge fills up, you'll gain a thaumaturgical point. And you can spend these points on sort of like a skill tree. There are 4 different stats in this game that represent the 4 sort of forces of personality that you're developing. So you've got heart, mind, deed, and word. And each of the traces that you find will actually need a skill check for each of these 4 stats before you can get all of the possible clues from it. If you don't pass the skill check, then you'll only get like basic cursory information for what it is, and it'll tell you what stat needs to be at what threshold in order for you to reveal all of the information. So you might find something that needs mind 3, and if you don't have mind 3, then it'll only give you the most basic glance at what it actually is, and all of its more emotional relevance will be hidden from you until you reach that threshold. So you can use these points to develop each of those stats, and also every time you put a point in one, it'll also give you one of these little upgrade card things that you can attach to your various attacks to improve them in battle. Eventually, each of these lines will end in sort of a gate that is one of the salutors. And once you reach this gate, you can't put any more points into that stat until you find the relevant salutor in the story or on a side quest. And then once you find them, you can continue to develop that stat further until you reach the next gate. So exactly how high you can get these 4 stats is determined by what salutors you currently possess. I do like the fact that there are also new attacks that you'll get eventually in these lines, and every slot is actually 3 different attacks. You'll only start with 1 in each slot, but eventually you'll unlock the rest of them as you keep putting points into these lines. And the attacks have to go in a certain order. So your first most quick slot will be just a basic jab at first, and then you'll get like a sort of follow-up jab, and then an even heavier strike that's also still pretty fast. And you have to do them in order from 1, 2, 3, so they're like combo slots, basically. And also each attack has a certain number of slots that can be filled with these upgrades that you've been purchasing on the skill tree, and you can make the attacks have extra benefits for you, so you can create sort of a build. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's a good system, although I do wish we could modify our Salutor's attacks in various ways too. I think there's a lot of possibility for some cool gameplay changes that you can make by altering those, but all the alterations you can make are to your own attacks. Overall, I think it's a really, really solid investigation RPG that does a great job with the investigation aspect. I think this game is at its best when you're finding all these traces and trying to piece together what's been happening in this area and figure out who's got what. It does a great job at creating a sense of mystery in each of its investigation zones and makes you want to figure out what's happening. I also really like the fact that the game presents flaws as not an entirely bad thing. It's a lot more complicated than that, and it makes the choices you have to make more difficult. They're not really good versus evil choices. So just as a couple of examples, you'll find a woman whose flaw is audacity, and it's causing her to steal from her employer to feed her little brother at home because they're living in poverty. However, the person that she's stealing from is a very dangerous man that runs a brothel and like a sort of gang in this area. So if you take her audacity from her, you're making her safer because she's no longer stealing from a very dangerous man. But what happens to her little brother at home? Are things going to get worse for them because she no longer has the audacity to steal for them? It's not really entirely clear if it's a good idea to do this or not. It seems like it probably is, but it will have some negative effects later on down the line. Another example is that you will go to a beautiful church and find a little boy, and this little boy is getting an exorcism and it's not working. And that's because he's not possessed. He actually is a Thaumaturge, but no one really knows it yet, and you were the first one to identify that he's getting these powers. Every Thaumaturge has a flaw. Your character's flaw is pride, by the way, and it's this flaw that leads their first Salutor to bind with them and awaken their powers. However, this little boy is having a really hard life because he can, talk to objects and see things that no one else can see and stuff like that, so everyone thinks he's possessed. So your choices are to take away his flaw and make him have a maybe happier or safer life where, he doesn't have to worry about this, but he will never awaken to his powers and never become a Thaumaturge. Or let him keep his flaw where he'll have probably a more unpleasant life because people will mistrust him, but he will eventually awaken to his powers and be able to help other people. So it's choices like these that make the overall landscape of this game's sort of decision-making really interesting to me, because they're never presented as good or evil. One is not obviously the correct one, and one is obviously the jerk one. They usually don't work that way. And in fact, for your character, you can see how helpful a flaw can be, because there will be various dialogue options that have this red crown next to them, and this feeds into your pride. These are proud options that allow your flaw to shine through, and these are not always bad. Some of these are actually really good and can get you out of some nasty situations, although since it is pride, some of them can get you deeper into worse situations as well, depending on what you're saying. But the point is, you actually have to feed your pride by selecting these options more often in order to get more of them, and the more of them you choose, the more of them you'll get later on down the line. Eventually, you might reach some options that are grayed out because you're not proud enough to say them, because you haven't been feeding this flaw enough to be able to say them yet. So giving in to your flaw is not a bad thing necessarily. It's not shown to be something that obviously makes you a bad person. There's a lot more complication to how it's used. Speaking of complication, we've also got a very complicated political landscape to navigate in this game because it's 1905 Poland, so we've got all sorts of different forces that are vying for this area. We've got the Tsarist forces causing lots of problems. We've even got mentions of the Romanov family, and this is actually the time in which Rasputin himself will be visiting, we'll say, the Romanov family and beginning the sort of end of his life. And your father, part of the story is regarding your father and his relationship with certain revolutionaries who are trying to put Poland back on the map, literally. So there's a lot of really well done political commentary in this game in regards to this area and this time frame that could really only be done this well by people from the area. And that also goes for the voice acting because, of course, this is Polish, so there's a lot of words that are very difficult for my silly American brain to pronounce, but with actual native speakers, they do a fantastic job, especially when it comes to some other languages and stuff here as well, because there's, of course, lots of Russian, and the secret police, their name has more letters than I've ever seen in my entire life, but the native speakers pronounce it flawlessly. So you get some really good voice acting in this game in regards to an authentic feeling historical representation of this area and time. Overall, so far, I've been really impressed with the Thaumaturge, and I would heartily recommend it to people that like investigation-themed games, that like lighter RPGs that are about lots of reading and exploring and talking to NPCs and things like that, with a smattering of combat in here as well to help to break things up. I think it's a really well-paced game with a fun story and some interesting characters, and it takes place in an area and time that we just don't see very often in video games. So seeing more representation for this sort of thing is really, really cool, especially when it's represented with this level of authenticity and passion for the historical and political and mythological aspects of such a rarely seen area. So I will put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page to the Thaumaturge so that you can go and check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.